Hey guys, today we're going to look at Chapter 7, Section 1 from your text that does go over World War I and Pennsylvania. In general, Chapter 7 in your text goes over pretty much Pennsylvania from the 1900s to 1950s, which would include both world wars, the 1920s, and a crazy consumer culture, and also depression. During this time, if you remember from Chapter 6, we're still dealing with so much in Pennsylvania and so much in our country. We did make that switch in Pennsylvania from being an agricultural giant to being an industrial giant. We're still working out the kinks in businesses. The people, unions, government, and corporations are all working for and against each other for better conditions, better wages, and so on. Things are starting to get better. We still are dealing with Reconstruction and race relations all across the country and in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania would still have some downtowns and still deal with some aspects of Jim Crow. Women's roles were still changing, and just overall, this is the time that so much change is happening all at once. Transportation and technology is changing, if you remember. We are building roads. We are making that transition away from horses to automobiles. But anyway, today we will talk about World War I and Pennsylvania. John Green, who does Crash Course History videos, said it best when he explained World War I as a spark that changed so much. For instance, we have this war, and that's one of the factors that would lead to the Depression. It's one of the factors that would lead to the rise of Hitler, which would also lead to the Holocaust, the creating and the use of the atomic bomb, and then you can even say the breakup of several empires, the Cold War, and even Vietnam. So this event isn't the war that most kids get excited about. That's usually World War II. Might be a little strange that kids get so excited for war in general, but that's a discussion for another day. But this whole thing would be catalyzed by just one act of terrorism. And then soon millions dead, there's fighting and combatants from all around the world, and the end result just leads to another war. So before we go any further, I do just want to ask you a couple bell ringer questions for you guys to answer in the comments. 1, what do you know about World War I? Please write your answer before you watch the rest of this video. You can even pause this, write it down. I want to know what you know. Number 2, here's the million-dollar question. How do we prevent wars today? What are some solutions to wars or stopping wars or preventing wars that you have today? Some other things to think about, but you don't necessarily have to answer in the bell ringer. But these are some questions I probably would ask you in class. Is war ever justified? Many students and history teachers and even historians would say we have several good justified wars that we should have done, such as the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the World Wars. But some people would even argue against some of these. Now, if you'd like to comment, you can. Just tell me what you think. Is war ever justified? And if so, what are some justified wars that we have made the right decision? At the same time, are there any wars or conflicts that we've been involved in that maybe weren't justified? What do you think? Another question to think about, but you don't necessarily have to answer. Is it okay for the government to force citizens to join the military? All right, what I'm going to go over today is some context on World War I, such as the causes. I think this is always important to look at the causes. We have to get better at learning why things are the way they are. We have to learn cause and effect. We have to learn critical thinking, and we have to be able to predict patterns. We'll also look at Pennsylvania's role in all this. What were our contributions? What was it like? And then at last, we'll look at the impacts of the war. What is the war's legacy? What is the world like after it? Did anything get solved? So the war would begin in Europe. It was sparked by the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austria-Hungarian throne. He was killed by the Black Hand. He was killed in Bosnia by a Serbian nationalist who wanted their country to be free. They took a wrong turn. Gavrilo Princip saw him. He walked up and shot him and his pregnant wife. This could have been a local conflict between the two empires. But no, it was a world war. And the US would get involved, and many other countries. One by one, all these local nations, all these allies will be pulled into it. Historians break up the two powers fighting into the Central Powers and the Allied powers. And for the majority of the war, the US did remain neutral. And why wouldn't they? It wasn't necessarily our war. We had friends on both sides, and we could make some money off both sides. So it wouldn't make much sense to jump into something that we didn't own, and we were benefiting so much off of everybody else fighting. Some examples of some of the Central Powers included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. Some examples of the Allied powers would be Serbia, France, Great Britain, Belgium, Italy, Russia, and then eventually, for the last 19 months, the US. But remember, there were more than that. We had up to 28 nations fighting. The causes of the war are typically broken down into 4 different items. First, imperial rivalries. We have tensions between these imperialist empires over territory, trade, and resources. And remember, this whole dispute, the whole assassination of the Archduke, had to do with territory and another country controlling another one. Sometimes countries and people in them don't necessarily like when another country comes in and controls their government, has their military there, or takes their resources. The second accepted cause is nationalism. How I describe it is a pride and loyalty and protectiveness, or maybe overprotectiveness of one's country and their culture and their identity as a nation. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. When we use nationalism this way, it's not like a pride within their country. It's more like an outward action. For instance, these people love their country, so they want to take over other ones and make it just like theirs because theirs is the best. The third cause is entangling alliances. If you remember, this could have been a local conflict, but it wasn't, and so many countries got drug in. The last one is militarism. This is described as the building or glorifying of military and even the glorifying of war. Pop culture is all about war. You think it's good for your country, it's good for your country's history. There's so much glory in it. So the war's going on, and let's fast forward to the last year and a half. The US would eventually join the war, and we would join because of many different reasons. To start, we did have a financial obligation to the Allies. We made a lot of money on both sides, but eventually we would start to trade much more with the Allied powers. Now, when I say there's a financial obligation, that means what happens if the Allies lose, if they owe us much more? When I typically ask students why the US joined the war, right away they say the sinking of the Lusitania. But it's not necessarily right. It's not completely wrong, but it's not fully correct. Quick evidence is that it was sunk, and we didn't even declare war until 2.5 years later. A better answer than the Lusitania, which would include it, would be unrestricted submarine warfare. Eventually they would kill more US citizens. Woodrow Wilson, our president at the time, would be outraged. Another cause for the US to join would be the Zimmerman telegram. British intelligence would decode this message from Germany to Mexico, essentially saying that if Mexico would start a border dispute with us and distract the US from joining, that with a German victory that they could get half their country back again. We find out about it and we're outraged, and this is one of the biggest reasons Congress would declare war. Another reason I've listed to make the world safe for democracy. This is what Woodrow Wilson says a lot, but I put it in quotes because it does sound nice and it is the right thing to do based on our U.S. values and our Declaration of Independence, but it's not always aligned with what some of our people do. For instance, Wilson was invading countries before this and had nothing to do with democracy. And that's why I left it in quotes, because it is inconsistent with his actions. One last reason, which is very powerful then and now, is propaganda. My definition is any medium that's used to shape opinion. So this could be music, it could be a movie, it could be a magazine article, it could be a poster. Sometimes maybe it's spot on, or sometimes maybe it's exaggerated or even fabricated and made up. And here's some examples of the propaganda, not just from our nation, but from others. What any country wants to do is try to paint their enemy in the worst possible way. If you have the public or soldiers that see their enemy as monsters, as kid killers, as women killers, then it's a lot easier to pull the trigger. So based on that list of causes for the US to join, we would declare war in April 1917. We did need an army, and a lot of European countries didn't even take our army serious. It wasn't very big and it wasn't a professional army. So to give ourselves a larger army, our government did pass the Selective Service Act. What this did was select men at random from the ages of 18 to 45 years old to go and serve in the military. Pennsylvania would send about 370,000 soldiers. In fact, 1 out of every 12 soldiers in the army came from Pennsylvania. Huge amounts of war materials were made in Pennsylvania, such as steel, iron, munitions, weapons, guns. Ships and shipbuilding was done in Philadelphia. Textiles and clothes, coal, and even food was all produced in Pennsylvania and sent towards the war effort. Pennsylvania would have over 3,000 businesses producing for the war effort, and about 1/7 of all the materials sent for the war came out of Pennsylvania. And furthermore, over half of the steel used in the war was created in Pennsylvania. Over 75% of the war's boots are created in Pennsylvania. Over 20% of the war's glass is made in Pennsylvania. Over 40% of the U.S. ships are made in Pennsylvania. Almost half of all the war's ammunition is coming from Pennsylvania. And hundreds of millions of tons of coal is being mined in Pennsylvania for the war effort. And with all these supplies, that's not to dismiss so much more in Pennsylvania, such as all of our hospitals and our medical professionals, all of our agriculture, and our crops and our food. Thousands of women in Pennsylvania would replace all the men that would leave in so many different jobs. And some even went off into war to be nurses or drivers or clerks. We also had tens of thousands of African Americans move up north into Pennsylvania cities such as Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, try to escape so many of the bad things from the South. And then oftentimes they're still faced with it, it's just different in the north. Pennsylvanians would also contribute over $3 billion in war bonds. What a war bond is a citizen loan to government, and citizens can make money off it, but typically not a lot. And last, Pennsylvanians would also help out with rationing, just like any other citizen in our states. This would mean that they would limit their purchasing, or maybe altogether not be able to get a certain good, because this good would go towards a war effort, such as coal. There are other things going on in Pennsylvania at this time too during the war. In the 19 months we are involved, there still are fights over labor conditions. There's still strikes and riots. At this time, just like any national emergency, even like a pandemic we're in now, typically the government or even the federal government takes more power. They do limit citizens' rights. For example, the government did pass the Espionage and Sedition Act. They would use this in Pennsylvania to lock up some labor organizers that would say things about corporations. So these people wouldn't be able to meet or say anything bad about the government or the war because they could be locked up. The government's rationale is that we can't have workers go on strike right now because we're at war. We know that you want better conditions and you want a good wage. You want to survive your work day after a year and not be injured. Work has to go on. You cannot stop it. We need materials for the war. So once again, the US would only be involved for about 19 months once it joined, and the Allied powers would win. So if you'd like to know more about the actual war and some of the battles, I can send you more resources on that. But Germany would sign an armistice. This would mean that there was a ceasefire, the fighting would stop, and then they would have to come to terms, some sort of agreement. Leaders would meet at Versailles to work out the peace agreement. Woodrow Wilson would be there, and he would try to dictate some of the terms. And although he wasn't that great of a guy, his ideas for the 14 points are pretty awesome. They include open diplomacy, freedom of the seas. He called for country sovereignty. He wanted to redraw some boundaries, and he wanted to create a League of Nations, which is basically the precursor to the United Nations. And we don't actually join it, even though he creates it. So these ideas were pretty awesome, but none of them were really used. Now, this treaty obviously didn't work out because we had another world war. In fact, the way this treaty was laid out probably contributed to the Second World War. For example, Germany had to take the blame, even though there was a lot of blame to go around, and it wasn't necessarily Germany's fault in this one. You can say World War II, yeah. World War I, Germany also had to lose their colonies, shrink their army, and pay an enormous amount of reparations. Reparation just meaning a payment typically for some wrongdoing. I did something wrong, here's money. The impacts for the war include death and destruction, a post-war overproduction, which typically leads to some sort of recession, an increased role in government, and especially the federal government. Right-leaning people would probably say this is a huge issue, while left-leaning people would probably say that's not a big deal. It did help the U.S. become more involved in world affairs. It did break up several empires, including Russia, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it did in general just totally ruin so many parts of Europe physically and economically. So two last things I have for you that are a bit off but still on topic, some temporary ceasefires. When I was a student, I always thought war was super interesting, and I still do, but more and more I also think that ceasefires and peace is also interesting. One event that not many people know about is the Christmas Day truce in 1914, where soldiers in trenches on both sides would start to sing and celebrate right around Christmas and Christmas Eve. The story goes that on the night they were singing, they heard familiar songs. They began poking their heads up and coming up. And then before you know it, they're in no man's land, shaking hands, trading trinkets, talking to each other, clearing no man's land of their fallen comrades, and even playing soccer. So I think the bottom line of this class from start to finish is just that soccer makes the world a better and more peaceful place. One other armistice that I think is extremely interesting has to do with the Western Front between Germany and Russia, where they actually would have to work together and stop fighting temporarily to go and kill giant packs of wolves. So that is all I have for you, but I do want to go over several review questions for you to answer in the comments. 1. What were the causes of World War I? 2. What was Pennsylvania's role and contributions to the war? And 3. What were the impacts of World War I? As always, please participate. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or feedback or any comments. If you want more reading or more videos or any other resources on this stuff, I can send it and share it with you. And let me know if you need anything else. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.